Hortons will advertise in their advertising campaigns, will attempt to make themselves and ingrain themselves as a part of what it is to be Canadian. Other elements of shared culture is symbols. Okay, each nation has its own symbols that represents either the flag or various other elements of that culture. So in Canada we have the maple leaf, we have the flag, maple leaf on the flag obviously. Some people look at Mounties, or the Canadian Mounted Police, as being a defining feature of Canada. Okay, so again, all these things are shared, and meaning and understanding amongst people develops out of this sharing of norms, beliefs, values, and material objects. The third element, or defining feature of culture, that sociologists will point to is that culture is transmitted. This means that it is passed from one generation to another. Okay, and passing down culture from one generation to another is one of the most important features of every culture. It is the way by which every culture reproduces itself. Okay, and it is the way by which the newer generations within that culture have these norms, values, beliefs, and mores communicated to them, in which they are indoctrinated into the beliefs and values that make up that culture. So, important to communicate and indoctrinate younger generations to cultural practices. So an example of this would be Aboriginal societies and other pre-literate societies that would pass down their beliefs through oral traditions. And this would be through legends, mythic structures, and detailed stories otherwise. And through these, the children would learn the important values and beliefs of the culture. And you do this by listening to these stories, and through these stories, again, you could pull out what that culture values and thinks is important, and again, you would pass on these traditional tales and stories to the next generation, who would then pass them on to the generation after that, and then you see how culture is continually transmitted from the older generations to the younger generations, and is able to reproduce itself. Otherwise, we might lose the culture if this process does not continue. Now, the fourth principle that sociologists would point to as a defining feature of culture is that culture is cumulative. What this means is that the beliefs and traditions are modified over time. So what your grandfather and great-great-grandfather and how they used to associate and incorporate the beliefs of the culture will still be with us today, but I'm sure they have been modified to a certain extent to reflect modern ways of living, as well as technological advancements and these types of things. So what we do, or how culture is cumulative, is that it builds on the base established by ancestors, and it is modified over time, okay, by younger generations, okay, but they're incorporating the knowledge of their ancestors into the way that they reproduce those cultural techniques. So, as I mentioned, technology, right, could change how these practices are modified to adapt them to the modern world. Okay, and the fifth tenet that we have here, and I guess the final defining feature that many sociologists would point to as being a feature of culture is that culture is uniquely human. Right? Humans, so far, are the only species that we are aware of that develop culture. Animals, of course, they live in social groups, but they merely socialize. They don't develop cultural practices. Many of these socializing activities carried out by animals are a result of physical traits and characteristics such as who is the strongest male within the band and these types of things. So animals socialize but do not create culture. Only humans. So culture will define in human civilization how, when, why, and these types of questions regarding human communication. So how humans communicate, when they communicate, why they communicate. Okay? These are all a product of interaction between one individual and another as shaped by the beliefs and mores and values of that society. Okay? So humans are the only ones that develop culture, and of course this is why it is a social science within college or the universities for which we can study human culture. And again, this is not something that we find in the animal kingdom. So these 5 characteristics, features of culture, again, are that culture is learned, culture is shared, culture is transmitted from one generation to another generation. It is cumulative in that the beliefs of our ancestors have been modified by modern generations, and culture is unique to human interactions. Thus, from these 5 defining features, we can see that culture influences every area of our lives. Okay, this goes down from how we dress to who we marry, how we court, perhaps a member of the opposite sex or of the same sex, depending on which cultural group you decide to belong to. And again, this will be expressed later on in terms of cultures, subcultures, and countercultures, and we'll get into those definitions a little bit later in the week. So how we dress, who we marry, how we court, who we court, for example, what type of language we speak, how we interact with different members in different social positions. All these areas, culture is fully ingrained within our lives. So again, I mentioned earlier in this lecture that it was important to consider that culture has 2 major segments. Again, I said that there is a material element and there is an immaterial element. Okay, so we should really break that down a little bit more here. So the material element, as I mentioned, are the tangible artifacts, the physical objects, if you will, that are found in any society. So this could be anything from parks, buildings, jewelry, weapons is another good one that will define a specific type of culture, the art in that culture, the machines, means of production we talked about in Marxism, and clothing again. So all of these tangible artifacts will demonstrate, or the material artifacts will demonstrate how a culture has adapted to, and prospered even, in a specific physical environment. So for example, Inuit culture the material artifacts within Inuit culture, so the tools with which they use to hunt and build structures, igloos, these types of things previously, these will all define how Inuit culture has overcame the challenging and tough physical environment in the Canadian North, for example. So how people deal with life in the prairies, life in the mountains, life in the swamps, again, there will be a different culture that is formed around those tangible facts and physical environments. And these are the material artifacts that make up culture. Now, the immaterial artifacts, if you will, that make up culture, this refers, like I said, the opposite of the tangible artifacts. These are the intangibles and abstract components. All right, there we go. So these are all the things you can't touch, you can't see, but they are a major influence on life and how you interact with those around you. So these intangibles or abstract components are usually norms, values, beliefs, common patterns of behavior. Okay, also such things as a language. This is intangible. Of course, you can't touch it, can't hold it. Again, it is spoken, it is communicated between people. It is not tangible. Okay, gestures are intangible, and other forms of interaction. And we're going to break these down a little bit more in a second. So it is important to remember that with the material and the immaterial elements that are found, they both make up the culture. They are intertwined and bound with each other. Okay, so you can't separate the material from the immaterial when we are dealing with culture. So again, it is going to be the interaction of a specific group of people with the material environment, as well as all of the tangible artifacts that they develop in order to deal with that material environment and prosper in that material environment. And then there's going to be a variety of immaterial factors that develop in conjunction with those material factors that will form the cultural practices and values which that group of people understands and has assigned meaning towards. Now, as each of these is bound with one another, okay, this will allow us to understand, as I mentioned, a material factor as a park. Otherwise, a park might just be a patch of grass. What are the immaterial factors that make that patch of grass a park, where there is an understanding of how to act once you're in a park? For example, a place of relaxation or recreation, and other ideas such as this. So if the immaterial and the material are bound with one another, we are saying that the normative understanding, there's the cap lock again, of what people should do or how to act when they enter, for example, a brick building. And perhaps this brick building is full of books. So why is this a library? Okay. So it is just at the outset, you have a brick building, it's full of books. What are the immaterial factors, the norms, the values, the beliefs, the common patterns of behaviors that will tell you to be quiet when you enter a library, or that it's a place of study and to be respectful of other people as they are also reading? Okay, so these common understandings of what makes a building full of books a library, that's culture. Okay, or what makes a patch of grass a park. Okay, for example, a park, there's this normative understanding that a park is this place of recreation or relaxation during the day. I guess there's another vowel in here. Okay, but if we want to look at all these other immaterial factors, the laws, the norms, the values, we'll see that there are bylaws set up that make where you're not allowed to be in a park, I think in Hamilton, after 11 p.m. So if you're looking at all these, what makes this patch of grass or the culture surrounding this park as it relates to one specific group of people, we'll see that a park after 11 p.m. is considered by our culture to be a place of perhaps criminal activity or drug use. These sorts of factors. Okay, so by looking at all these, both the tangible and the intangible, the material or the immaterial elements, you are able to come to a better understanding of what is culture and how specific material artifacts enter into the culture of a specific group of people. Okay, so it is very important then to differentiate these non-material artifacts, because they play such a great role in determining the function, the use, and the way modes of interaction in our society. Okay, so we can have determining roles of interaction and modes of behavior in relation to physical objects in that society. So if we want to understand what it is about a specific, or what it is about Western culture that makes a brick building full of books a library, or what transforms a patch of grass into a city park, we have to differentiate these intangibles. Okay, and we're going to look specifically at what these intangibles are and talk a little bit about how they function in society. Okay, so we'll write here non-material artifacts. Had a little trouble with that word. All right. So the first thing we're going to look at is values. Okay, what are values? Now, values are the standards by which a specific society approves some things as good and disapproves of others. They are bad. Okay, what is good, what is bad, what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is desired, what is undesirable in society. Okay, these are values. Okay, so for example, values determine specific attitudes of how the world ought to be. So specific cultures will value specific things more than others. Okay, so if you want to look at capitalist society, Western capitalism, what is one social artifact that is valued as money? Okay, so there's a high value on money, so earning money and becoming rich in society is one of these values within Western society, in America and Canada and Europe, these places. Okay, whereas in other cultures they might not value money as much, and they might have no use for it in other societies. For example, they might value something else. Okay, so values are this first category of intangibles, of immaterial factors that has an influence on culture. The next category consists of norms. Okay, and what are norms? We mentioned norms often, we've defined them before, but we'll do it again. Norms are culturally defined rules that outline appropriate behaviors for members of that society or that group. So they guide people on how to act in specific social situations. Okay. One scholar by the name of W.G. Sumner has actually subdivided norms into two categories. It says the first one are folkways. First one is folkways. Okay, and what folkways are informal norms that suggest customary ways of behaving. Okay, and again, these are not going to carry a lot of moral condemnation from society if these folkways are not observed, but they are generally informal norms of behavior that reflect a customary way in which one society or one group of people would prefer to act in a specific situation. But again, no high moral condemnation if you break these specific norms. Now, on the contrary, there are mores. Now, mores are defined as norms that carry strong sense of social importance. Okay, so those culturally defined rules of behavior that you are expected to observe in our society. Okay, so these mores do inspire strong feelings of moral condemnation from society. So, for example, mores, if you look at the or a traditional Catholic family structure where you're not supposed to habitate or live with a partner out of wedlock, if you decided that, you might live with your girlfriend or live with your boyfriend without getting married first for a long period of time, live in common law, this might be condemned by specific Catholic cultures. Okay, so that would fall under the category of more. Okay, so these are, again, norms that carry a strong sense of moral condemnation. Okay, so the next category, intangible, these are laws, immaterial factors that influence, define, and shape culture. Okay, and laws are one of the easiest to understand. They are particular norms that have been codified.